Welcome back. You're watching Crossroads with Neethan and Shan. We're talking about immigration policies and the changes that have been brought in the last decade at the federal level. So let's talk a bit more about the sociological impact of this. This is a Tamil TV show. A lot of the Tamils came through either refugee claimant process, which we'll talk on a different show because that itself needs a comprehensive discussion. But then through family reunification after that, those who came in. So what kind of impact do you see in, we'll start with AV, in the communities that you serve with these changes?
Right. So I guess maybe looking at it two ways. One is on the sort of like their participation in the democracy, for instance, right? Because with the changes to citizenship, without citizen, you don't have the right to vote. And without the right to vote, you can't influence government policy. And it really, I think it sends a message to the people in the community that you don't belong here. Like, you know, we don't see you as part of our society. So I think that's also having a negative impact on our community. And thinking of, like, you know, sort of you think about the requirements, who will be affected, as I mentioned, refugees will be affected, living caregivers, people who don't speak English as a first language. So chances are they are from the racialized communities, right? So again, it's like sending a message to these community members that, you know, you are different, you are not, you are a second-class citizen. In terms of the sponsorship, the family sponsorship side, and I think just go back to my earlier point about, you know, sort of like people do not feel a sense of belonging as well if you're not able to bring your spouse, your kids, your parents to Canada. It's almost like Canada only wants your labor, but they don't want your family. So I think those are all the wrong messages that our government is sending.
Yeah. And you see a lot of South Asian clients, including clients from the Tamil community as well, right? Do you see the negative impact directly as clients walk in?
Absolutely. We're seeing a significant number of denials of sponsorship applications, whether they be parent or they be spousal sponsorship or child sponsorship, for all of the reasons of all of the changes. You know, and we've skimmed over parent, but the thresholds financially to sponsor a parent have jumped dramatically. The way you can sponsor, the quotas are really limiting. And I think there's a failure. I think A.B. made the point that our immigration policy doesn't reflect what we value as family. The idea that parents are second-tier family members is just, it's not, you know, a value that we see for the clients that we serve. They're immediate family and in fact provide a lot of support. I think unfortunately what's happening is as these options for permanent residents close off and become more different, what we're seeing now is that people now are coming to Canada in less numbers, but as temporary workers. And they are now forced to work in very precarious working conditions with temporary status, which doesn't always lend itself to becoming permanent residents, because there's now a completely new system around getting permanent residents if you're a skilled worker or a temporary worker. So what it's doing for our communities is pushing more and more people into that group of temporary workers who then have all these other consequences. They don't have certain health care coverage, they don't have access to any services, and they have a very hard time in terms of how they're treated by their employers because their hands are basically tied, right? And so it puts people in a dangerous environment. And the reality is, for those people who are here in Canada as permanent residents and citizens, we're telling them what exactly we said. We want your labor, but we don't think you're entitled to have all of these other things, like having your parents here, having your children who are 20 here. And that's devastating, because I think what it does is it marginalizes those communities, right? And you see that anger building around being sort of pushed to the side as not being important.
So regardless of immigration's role in building this country in terms of economic or social infrastructure and kind of the viability of the country itself, we've seen this historically happen. I'm going to take a bit of a historic look, whether it's the head tax stuff or whether it's Komagara Maru. It's a similar underlying themes of who you want, why you want them, how long you want them, who they can bring, and so on, right? So are we making progress, or is it even becoming harder to name things now than before?
Well, I think Definitely, I think there's a lot of sort of historical revision, sort of, or sort of like we're going back to the history as we look at the immigration changes today, as if we have learned nothing from what we have done in the past. And at the same time, I think also it's deliberate, right? So because at the same time when these changes are happening to our community, because we're more likely to sponsor parents and grandparents, we're more likely to be sort of bring in spouses from overseas, like China, India are two of the most popular countries where sponsored spouses are coming in from. Our government is also making it easier for some other people to come, right? The Irish are coming in larger number these days as tourists, and working tourist visas, right? And so they are loosening up rules for some communities, but tightening it up for others. So definitely, I see a repeat of some of the historical things. But of course, at the same time, because we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so government can no longer overtly discriminate on the basis of race. So it's all very systemic, and it's all kind of very sort of hidden kind of discrimination. If we don't name it, if we don't see the impact, then we will just think that, well, the government is just doing it in the name of something else, like, because it's here to protect the taxpayers, or, we're protecting us from the marriage fraud. When they talk about marriage fraud, they are certainly targeting only, people from China and India and nobody else. You mentioned the guide that, earlier, it's an internal training guide for immigration officers, where they actually say, like, sort of like, if it's a Chinese student marrying a non-Chinese, then, chances are it's a fraudulent marriage. If they all post pictures at, Niagara Falls, then it's a fraudulent marriage.
Or if they are not kissing lip to lip
not kissing
in
lip.
a picture.
Or they don't have money to buy diamond ring, it's a marriage
if it's not a diamond ring.
Yeah.
So this is like a very classist, sexist, racist document.
Exactly.
Even if it's an internal training, external, it's government employees. Right. I think that there's a lot to be questioned around that. So let's talk a bit about how are these policies being sold to the public, because there seems to be a bit of willingness to accept this in general public, right?
Yeah.
Is it because of lack of awareness about the impact of this on a socio-economic, political, racial impact, or is it because it's being packaged in a way that it's not seen as a significant change?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think the reality on the changes in sponsorship was the dialogue has been around protecting Canadians and Canadian sponsors from marriage fraud, right? And fraud has become the underlying supporting activity to create policies like the conditional permanent residence, right? What I think the reality is, now that we're starting to see some of the, I say intended consequences, what I think the government would say is unintended consequences, are that those policies target specific communities, specific races of people, and specific genders, in particular women, which is a point that really needs to be made as well. I think the problem is, when you look at a policy on its face, it's actually applicable to anybody who puts in a sponsorship application. So on its face, it's a neutral sort of policy, but the reality is, how is it being applied? Who is it being applied to? And when you see the number of people who are coming now as conditional permanent residents, the #1 country that they're coming from is India, and the #2 country is China. And everybody else, when you look at a bar graph of it, is down here, and those two countries are up here. So the reality is, those programs were targeted at certain communities, but they're sold to us in Canada as a neutral policy to protect everyone against marriage fraud. And you can take that example with parent sponsorship, right? They brought in, as you mentioned, a super visa. They said, you can reunite with your parents under this super visa. What they don't talk about is, you have to meet certain financial criteria to be eligible. You also have to pay for your parents' health care for 3 years. So that, in and of itself, locks out not just low-income people, but actually almost everybody who might consider trying to get their parent here on a super visa, because you just won't financially qualify. So on its face, it seems great, this fast way to bring your parents. You have to look behind it at all of the requirements and exemptions and all of the things you need to meet, which don't allow it, right? And so I think we need to do more awareness and more education, and people need to look behind those large grand scale announcements from the government about these great policies to say, wait a second, some of the people that we know who were very excited about the super visa didn't realize that they themselves would never qualify.
So right? After 10 years or a number of years, or even currently, are there statistics available as to how many applied and how many were rejected, and how many are from which country of origin, or how many were rejected because of income, or is it something that they could provide or we could access to look at?
For something, yes. So for instance, because we try to launch a charter challenge to the previous sponsorship requirement, and at that time we asked for statistics in terms of breakdown of the number of applications for parents, grandparents, from which country, how many were rejected, is it more likely to be a female or a male sponsor? So all of those statistics we actually got up to 2011, and you see, like, the pattern is like, chances are more likely if you're a woman sponsor, you're more likely to not able to meet the requirement. The majority of the parents and grandparents are coming from what we call the developing countries. And China, India are among the top countries in which these applications are coming from. So it's consistent with what we know. We haven't got any up-to-date information since the new requirements come into effect, but I would suspect that it will be similar in terms of the countries, the applications who are trying to be submitted. I don't even have any idea whether they keep track of applications that don't meet the 5,000 quota, right? So, whether they just stop collecting or not, right? So,
great. So before we go on to a break, just we talked a bit about the gendered impact as well as the racial impact also. We talked a bit about the class stuff. Sometimes, the people who have, been here for a number of years and so on believe that, the fees are reasonable if you want to be a citizen of this great nation, kind of a thing, right? But we come across families that say, they're sending application on 2 members first, and then waiting for the other 2 members after a year. Like, what kind of psychological impact would it have for a family when you have 2 people become citizen earlier because they couldn't afford to? And how do they pick those people and stuff like that, right? So is that a reality that many people ignore in terms of financial consideration, or is that something that people believe that they should be able to pay if they want to be a citizen? Or is it even necessary because they already pay a landing fee and other things too?
I agree. I mean, I think when you think about the raise in citizenship fees to something like $630, and if you had a typical family of 4, that's $2,500 almost that you have to come up with to become a citizen, which if you've been living in our country and paying taxes and contributing, you essentially already are, right? That's just kind of the rubber stamp of it. And so that idea then that you then have to actually pay that much more to become the thing that you essentially already are is problematic. I mean, I think that if people, if we value citizenship, right? The idea around all of the discussion about getting citizenship is it's something to be held dearly and valued, right? That's an ideological perspective. But if we value it so much, why do we create a financial barrier for people to apply for citizenship? I think that in terms of processing applications, I don't think a fee is required to process those applications, and it is a huge barrier. So that idea that maybe me and my husband will apply, and then we'll wait for our children, and consider the amount of bureaucracy and the level of administration for doing it once for these family members, and then coming back years later doing it again for another set of family members. That, coupled with the fact that the actual processing of citizenship applications now is much more complicated. The residency requirements, looking into whether people meet the residency requirements, the barriers to becoming citizen have been very intense. And I think paying fees for those applications is challenging. If you think about a lot of the communities we serve, the Tamil communities who came as refugee claimants, A significant number of those clients missed the deadline for permanent residence solely because they could not come up with the right of landing fee. So we're telling people, we recognize that you're a protected person, there's no way you can return home, you're in danger, but we're not going to allow you to land because you can't pay a fee.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
And I think
unfortunate.
that's,
And the other question I wanted to ask, you can continue with that too,
Yeah.
is about the financial obligations in terms of the standard amount that they need to meet in terms of income,
Right.
where income hasn't been going up
Yeah.
for many people.
Yeah.
And you know, I know family members who've been making the same amount literally for last 10 years
Yeah.
in certain jobs. Right? So you know, it's also contrary to what the reality of people is, right? You know,
Yeah.
it's not like, you know, the overall prosperity is going up, so you make it a different standard, right?
Yeah, and of course, we also know there's racialization of poverty, particularly right now in Ontario. We know that if you're a person of color, you're more likely to live in low income. So you're more likely to be not able to meet the new heightened LICO requirement, right? And also on top of that, like, you know, as Shan mentioned, because I think the government is justifying that we need a higher fee because, you know, we need the fee to pay for the administration. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
You make it more complicated, so it's more costly to process citizenship. So you charge people more. But then I think it's more like the government is seeing it as the only person who is benefiting from it is the applicant himself or herself, as opposed to seeing this is a broader social group. You want more people to become citizens so that they can participate in democracy, so that they have a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
It's not a privilege, it's a right, and the people have earned that right, and it is the good thing to do for our country. So they should not be they don't have to bear the burden of the entire cost of the administration of the system.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what are some avenues to get help, but also to change some of the things that we are seeing that are not working for our communities. So let's take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about those two issues.